were all against German law at the time, as well as some of the more heinous ideas they had about racial extermination, but it was still in there. One of the things that Hitler was attempting to do throughout this entire period, particularly from 1929 to 1933, and eventually in 1934 when they start to consolidate their power, which I'm going to show you a documentary about today from the World War, is this idea of how to spread their radical, seemingly radical ideas, particularly when it pertained to political economic aspects of Germany. Come on. I do want to mention, though, beforehand, before we get involved in this, first of all, the next person who speaks without raising their hand is getting 5 points taken off. I just won't tolerate this anymore. You are stepping on other people. Maybe you do have the answer, but 5 other people do as well. And if it continues to occur, it's going to be only these 2 or 3 people who keep doing this repeatedly. And I want a more broader conversation. Okay? Secondarily, when you make a point, make it germane to the point. Okay? I'm serious about this raising hand stuff. I'm just going to, I will ignore you at first, and then if you continue to do it, I'm going to have you removed from class. Okay? So please, raise your hand. And again, it's disrespectful when somebody else has an answer and you would blurt it out. Okay? Or think that your ideas are so much better than everybody else's. Okay? If that's the case, how come you're not president? Anyway. So one of the things that Hitler was trying to figure out was not only how to implement some of these social programs, which many of them he didn't believe in, particularly these socialist stuff, but still try and work with pre-existing institutions to gain their support. Primarily the military, but also conservatives and the upper class were not in the mood to vote or give power to some seemingly crazy corporal from World War I who had some crazy ideas and was somewhat of a good speaker, but still people didn't trust him. I think one of the interesting things that occurred was, I know there's a lot of characters in the book, you know, historical figures that were there, and it's hard to keep track of all these things. But if you look at some of these people like Papen and Schleicher and a lot of these other ones, all these people that were either chancellor before Hitler or were trying to negotiate with him, what type of impression did you get about these people? Were they so much worse than Hitler? Or so much better? Let me put it another way. Were they so much better than Hitler? Were they trying to really stop him, or were they actually doing things that were encouraging him and trying to use him? So remember, raise your hand. So what were the politicians like surrounding Hitler? And in general, the ones in the German democracy. Yeah, no, worst of all, they were just as slimy as he was on a lot of levels. And what it allowed Hitler to do was sort of hide his true intentions, because the way the German people were starting to see it was, hey, here's Hitler trying to do something, and these other people trying to use Hitler. And it was almost a tug-of-war between these more conservative and elitist elements in the government and the general public. And what Hitler was trying to impress upon them was that he would get the people's support one way or the other, and if he thought he had to go back to illegality, he would have. What's interesting is when Hitler was essentially, remember they had like 5 or 6 elections within 2 or 3 years. What impression does that give the German people about the German government? Right, and these people don't know, and they don't. And worst of all, I'm starving in the streets, and you jerks are up here arguing in your silk suits and your expensive food and all this other garbage, and you're not suffering. What do you care, right? You're playing party politics, and because Germany didn't have a history of party politics, Hitler could go up and say, "See, this is what you get with democracy." And one of the first things he promised was, "I'll wipe these parties off the map. I'll stop this crap. There won't be elections every 2 months." Here's what's interesting. In 1933, one of the strategies of Papen and some of the conservatives and people who supported von Hindenburg was to have all these elections repeatedly to weaken the Nazi Party. They thought if we keep having elections, they'll keep running their mouths, and bad things will come out in the press about them, and they'll start losing it. What's interesting is that right in 1933, right before Hitler got enough votes essentially to put him over the top to become chancellor, what was the state of the party at that point? If you guys remember, was it in good shape? Did it have the resources to move on, or was it sort of almost near collapsing? I think this is a crucial point to make about history here, because history would have been different. Right. And what's interesting enough, too, everybody realizes that Hitler had this attitude towards communists, that he just wanted them to die. The communists are the ones who voted to dissolve the government for the final election campaign to get popping out of office. That eventually is what led Hitler into office. And once Hitler became chancellor and Göring took over the state police, what happened at the next parliamentary meeting to the communists and the social democrats? Especially, what initially happened was the Reichstag fire. I mean, that was one. So the Reichstag fire occurred. Hitler's now chancellor. What happened to and the communists were blamed. So what happened to the communist officials that had like 108 seats, Jeff? Well, he arrested them. And the social democrats either was arresting them or threatening them. And again, I told you, look, things are illegal until someone gets into power and makes them legal. And that was Hitler's goal from the beginning. Was to, he figured out, because in 1923, remember when he got thrown in jail, that you know what, if you do this, and he built up way more enemies by 1930. You know, the public won't be with you, the press will be against you, and this was before Hitler had control of the press, so they were critical of it. That, hey, I'll play this game and keep the SA under control, and I'll engage in the elections, and I'll even do little side deals. But once I do get to power, then the gloves are coming off, and I'm going to consolidate my control of the federal government. He set Göring in to control the Prussian state, which is essentially where the Gestapo was the state Prussian police. The state of Prussia contained 2/3 of the entire German population. It was the key to controlling it. And the Nazis weren't very strong there. And in one swift stroke, before Hitler was even the president, before Hindenburg even died, Göring went in there and said, all right, we're going to take over and we're going to start persecuting our enemies with the state police, even before democratic rights were suspended. Now, with the Reichstag fire, it was an easy excuse to take down things like... so what are some of the things that Hitler did and suspended in the time from 1933 until 1940, you know, into the 1930s, past 1933? What are some of the things that he outlawed? Somebody else besides Jeff? Somebody else read? What are some of the things he outlawed? What are the things he changed? Yes?
Could you like not speak out against the government?
That's it. That was one of the big things. What else? So what? Let's explore that a little bit more. So what did that entail?
Well, wouldn't people be like thrown in jail or worse, killed?
Right, but you can't keep the entire public.
It's not pretty much control the press.
Right. And he got rid of any newspapers that he didn't like.
I was going to say the press.
What else did he do? Do you remember?
Well, then
What did he do to political parties?
Well, then you make them their enemies. You made them enemies.
He outlawed political parties. Period.
Yeah.
To dare to even.
Nazi state is the only.
Right. That's basically what he said. It ain't the Nazi Party anymore. It's the state. He wanted it. And if you actually look at it, Nazism really wasn't a party. It was a revolutionary movement similar to communism that said, look, this is what we're going to do. What did he do to specific types of people besides political enemies?
Didn't he label them as certain things?
Well, particularly with Jewish people,
Yeah.
they attacked their shops. They would put SS soldiers out in front of it. They offered deportation to many of these people. Eventually, I think it was in Oraniensburg, north of Berlin, and also in Dachau. They started concentration camps from basically 1934 on.
Yeah, once Kristallnacht happened, they started deporting together.
And the video will talk about some of this kind of stuff. And slowly, I think the German people started to realize what they were in for. And what's interesting enough is that, remember all these slime balls that wanted to use Hitler? One of the ideas was, here's a mistake I think that the German government made. They thought if they gave it, and this is the same thing that happened with Neville Chamberlain, they thought if they gave Hitler power inside the German government, he would calm down. They thought, let's give him power like a baby with a binky in its mouth. We'll stick something in its mouth, and it'll shut up. And they thoroughly and completely underestimated Hitler's anger and hatred and how much he disliked democracy. So, popping and all these other fools, they got on June 30th, 1934, was what's called the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler did two things. First, he went after enemies that he didn't like Papin and all the rest, and got him to sign off on all this crap he was doing. Second of all, and most importantly, this organization here was not on his side. They didn't like the SA. Remember the stormtroopers? They said to Hitler, "Look, dude, we'll make you chancellor, but you got to take care of these fools, because we can't have these lunatics wandering around doing challenging the army." And Hitler first didn't want to do it, and throughout the entire month of June, they purged people, and they eventually shot Ernst Röhm and a whole bunch of others, the leaders of the SA, and then Hitler installed Himmler's SS as his personal bodyguard, which came out of the SA, but he consolidated support for the army. And what's hilarious is the army had been threatening him, saying, "If you don't do this, we're going to remove you from power, or we're going to take over militarily." The Hindenburg had a thing that said, "I will allow the military, if you, Hitler, don't stop this, I will allow the military to take over." And Hitler thought, "Well, I'll get them on my side." And the military thought, "Well, we'll use Hitler to gain even more support." And what they didn't realize was Hitler was just trying to get their approval so he could first integrate the SA into the army and build an army that much quicker and get his people into the army. And secondarily, the army obviously had no idea what he had in mind. Because had they known that by 1939 they would be essentially fighting a war, and then by 41 fighting a war seriously, on the fronts of Russia and then on the Western Front, I don't think the army would have signed up. But they used it just like Papin and the Social Conservatives did, to sort of say, we'll steal his thunder and use his power, and then we'll get what we want. And Hitler was going to do similarly the same thing. So, anyway, but just make sure to get the notes from somebody. It's okay.
That was it. Before, Hitler took power, there was a lot of restrictions on the German military from post-World War I. Like, they weren't allowed to build up the military. The Treaty of Versailles. I thought, like, when Hitler came into power, that he just decided to build up that military.
Well, he didn't have to, because the SA was about 500,000 troops at least, and most of them were former army officers or army soldiers, and some of them were officers. So you didn't really need to teach them. The only thing he needed to do was to make sure that they had an oath of allegiance to him personally, but more importantly, that they weren't going to try and disrupt the army command, who had gotten fat and comfortable in their life. But hey, all the army wanted was just get these idiots under control in the streets and let us live our nice life where we eat great food and we do whatever the hell we want. I mean, you look, you think Colin Powell is living in poverty? There ain't a single army general on this planet that lives in poverty. And frankly, in the United States, they're actually poorer than most other countries like Pakistan, because in Pakistan, they essentially run the place. If you're an Iranian general, you take whatever you want at any time you want. And if some old man in a beard gets in your way, man, it looks like he fell down the stairs. Broke his neck. 82-year-old Imam, whoops, dude. Don't get in the army's way. I'll tell you right now, look around the world how many countries are controlled by military people. Say some accident. Because military people have the legal authority and have the willingness to point guns at people's faces. And I think they underestimated Hitler and what he was willing to do. I think they really thought that this guy was not going to kill anybody. Okay? What's even sicker was there were Jewish people that helped Hitler rise to power. That they didn't even realize that they were harming their own people. Or they obviously didn't read Mein Kampf, because Hitler was clear from the mid-1920s on. Then, so he consolidates power in his nation. Then he goes to externalizing this. The ideas of racism and extreme nationalism, that Germans' nationality and nationalism should extend beyond their border. Okay? Extrapolating these ideas to Germany, to the rest of the world. It ain't good enough just to get rid of Jews in Germany. You got to get rid of all of them. It ain't good enough just to talk about African people. We got to get rid of them too. Or Slavs, or Russians, or whoever, Gypsies, all these mongrels. And then expansion of this idea out through the war mechanism. Okay? And again, Neville Chamberlain famously, in the appeasement, when Hitler took the Czech Republic, thought that, well, if we give him this, he probably won't want anything for a little bit while, a little more time. One of the issues that became was, I don't think people realized why Chamberlain and the French were unwilling to challenge Hitler. Does anybody know why? It's a pretty simple reason why they didn't want to fight a war with Hitler at that moment in time.
They're scared.
Huh?
They're scared.
No, it was more being scared. The French weren't scared of the Germans. Not really. Not completely. If you're scared of Russia, you wouldn't have done that before 1941.
They're trying to avoid another war.
That was part of it, but there's a reason why they were trying to avoid a war, because France preferred to beat Germany back early on and save the nonsense. They weren't prepared. They had no material to fight a war. They hadn't been improving their weapons since World War I. When Germany, one of the reasons why Germany was so successful with the Blitzkrieg, they were using brand new weapons that had just been developed last week. The United States only had 100,000 troops at the time and virtually had no material. They were using rifles from the World War I, and so were the British and the Russians. That's why the Germans ran through Poland in a week. It was like basically less than a week. They ran through France, which was supposed to be a pretty, hardy opponent, and I think it was almost the same exact amount of time. And I can understand Poland, but you're telling me you're going to run right through France? Because in the First World War, they were in trenches for 3 years. And they were fighting over like 20 feet of land. Hitler ran right in. He was in Paris like that. Because he had planes and the tanks and everything like that, and new guns and weaponry. Eventually, though, one of the interesting things about Hitler's own personal arrogance, it actually drove him to make weaponry, particularly tanks, that were, even though they were great weapons offensively, they were terrible because they moved very slow. There was two types of tanks in the later stages of the war that turned out to actually be somewhat of a liability eventually. The Panther tank, which was a much more improved version of some of the earlier tanks they used, which was very good, but it was vulnerable from the side. It took a lot of gasoline, and the problem is, when you're stuck out in the middle of the Soviet Union, there are a lot of gas stations sitting around the corner, so you got to drag the gasoline up by trucks. Trucks need gasoline. They didn't even, at one point during the war, the Germans didn't have the gasoline for the trucks to bring the gas trucks to the front. That's how dumb, and soldiers need food, and all kinds of other stuff. So you got serious problems. On top of that, they had this thing, one of Hitler's ultimate weapons was this thing called the Tiger tank. And they took this enormous anti-aircraft gun. It was enormous. It was stretched from here all the way here. And it weighed like some god-awful amount, like a ton. And just think about what kind of power and size of a tank you need to run a gun that's that big. Now, it was absolutely deadly. From I want to say it was like half a mile, you could shoot a shell and kill a tank. But the problem was, it didn't move very well, and it got bogged down, and it was heavy, and it got stuck in the mud. And so the Canadians and the Americans had these little tanks, and they would just come around to the side and blow these things up. But Hitler thought he was so brilliant that nobody would be able to destroy his tanks. And the Soviets did the same thing. The Soviets essentially had BB guns in the early stages when they started fighting the Germans and the Nazis. And even late in the war, in the Battle of Kursk, which was an enormous tank battle, they were using seriously inferior tanks on some levels, although their armor was still pretty good. But they were able to replace the tanks and replace the soldiers because Russia's industrial power was much better and they had more people. And Stalin reminds me of the charge at Gettysburg. Stalin just kept sending troops in. It's like, you know what? And Stalin's view of his own people wasn't very good, was it? So he saw two things going on. One, I'm getting rid of a bunch of people who might challenge me later, or my own people, so they're dying. And I'm killing the Nazis at the same time. So he had no qualms about sending waves of hundreds of thousands of men. That's one of the reasons why the Soviets lost so many people. Is that it was a war of survival at one point for the Soviets, and also that Stalin had he had no concern for human life. Not even his own, probably, on some levels, although he didn't kill himself.
Wasn't it the Nazis that got really close to Moscow, to conquering it?
No, it was like 10, 20 miles out, maybe. No, they got there. And then he turned, and then Hitler's... they went for the oil fields in the Caucasus region, and Hitler wanted to divert part of the troops to Stalingrad because it was Stalin's name on the city, and it was an industrial city, and his general said, "This is stupid. Go get the oil, and then on the way up, we'll take care of Stalingrad." And they also told him there's no strategic importance to this city, and they spent, I want to say the Germans lost almost 1 million soldiers or something stupid like that, both in casualties and people taken prison. The entire one of the entire armies, I think the Third Army or something, got taken captive inside the city. They made bunches of movies about Stalingrad, and in Russia they still talk about it to this day. It was the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front, and it's what pushed the Nazis back. And I think probably a lot of German soldiers thought, "Oh, we're in trouble now." And plus all the atrocities that the Nazis had committed, they knew that the Soviets were going to come back and be just as nasty. That's why there was such desperation at the later stages of the war. That's when people in Germany started acting crazy. They started having orgies and doing all kinds of crazy stuff and just partying all the time. And it was like an apocalyptic attitude started to develop. But let me read this on page 144, and you'll get an idea of the process that was going on, and then we'll watch the video. And I do want to mention, I know probably some of you are reading going, what's he going to test people on? What's he going to test people on? First of all, we're going to combine what I'm talking about on the board and in the slideshows with the book. So one of the things you need to keep abreast on in the book is how Hitler took power, some of the personal aspects of his personality, and the deviant acts that he committed. So keep those things in mind while you're reading, and I'll try and get your take-home test for you by next Monday. Okay? Actually, don't we not have class? No, that's. In a couple weeks, we got this goofy thing where Tuesday is going to be Monday, and I don't think we're going to be able to meet that day. So what I'll do is I'll probably give you an assignment that Tuesday to watch a video or something like that, because I teach at another school on Tuesday, and they're not doing this strange. Did you see that only a governmental or an educational institution could change Tuesday into Monday? If you tried to do that at IBM, man, you know, I mean, come on with that. It's just dumb. Why are you doing that? It's just silly. You just put another Wednesday at the end of the school. Anyway, at least we're getting out of here by May 4th or 5th or whatever. Anyway, actually on page 145 it says here, it is still a matter of controversy whether the burning of the Reichstag fire was in fact planned and carried out by the Nazis themselves. Remember, that was the thing that allowed Hitler to say the communists were trying to overthrow the government and that he needed to take presidential decree and emergency powers. As has long been believed, or whether van der Lubbe acted on his own, at any rate, there is no doubt who profited by the fire. The next day, Hitler promulgated a decree signed by the President for the protection of the people and the state. The decree was described as a defensive measure against communist acts of violence. It suspended the guarantees of individual liberty under the Weimar Constitution, authorized the Reich government, if necessary, to take over full powers in any federal state, increased the penalty for the crimes of high treason, poisoning, arson, and sabotage to one of death, and instituted the death penalty or hard labor for life in the cause of conspiracy to assassinate members of the government or grave breaches of the peace. Armed with these all-embracing powers, Hitler and Göring were in a position to take any action they pleased against their opponents. They cleverly postponed the formal proscriptions of the Communist Party until after the elections, so that the working class vote should continue to be divided between the rival parties of the Communists and Social Democrats. But acts of terrorism against the left-wing parties were now intensified. And remember, from the early part, the SA was engaging in street battles, which was the military wing of the Nazi Party, and throwing bombs at people, and you know, it was accused of assassination. So for the government now, the Nazi government, who had been involved in sowing social unrest, to now turn around and say, okay, nobody does anything in the streets. You see the hypocrisy, you see the contradictions, but you also see the attempts to gain power by this method too. In the last week of the election campaign, the Nazi propaganda machine redoubled the force of its attacks on the Marxists, producing the most hair-raising accounts of communist preparations for insurrection and a bloodbath, for which the Reichstag fire and the rest of the van der Lubbe, that was the guy who was accused of burning down the Reichstag, were used to provide substantiation. Hitler stormed the country, excuse me, in the last hurricane campaign Declaring his determination to stamp out Marxism and the parties to the left without mercy, for the first time the radio carried his words into every corner of the country. The campaign reached its climax on Saturday the 4th of March, the Day of Awakening Nation, when Hitler spoke in Königsberg, the ancient coronation town and capital of the separated province of East Prussia. Hitler declared, "One must be able to say once again, German people, hold your heads high and proudly once more." This also speaks to how Hitler used his own personal narcissism and pride of being German to infect the German people with this. And on Wednesday, when we get back to the lectures, I got a slideshow I'm going to show you about this. It was to... You are no longer enslaved and in bondage. You are free again and can justly say, "We are all proud that through God's powerful aid, we have once more become true Germans." This is what some people might term narcissistic nationalism or extreme nationalism, right? Americans get accused of this crap all the time. That Americans think their culture's the great. That's what you're told from the time you're born, isn't it? America's the greatest country on earth. The difference between this country and most other countries is most Americans will tell you, we've got proof. Okay, you can go around, Mongolia can go around saying it's the greatest country on earth. Is anybody going to believe that? And the proof is, are people trying to clamor to get into Mongolia to get a job at McDonald's? They don't think so. Whereas in this country, probably 1 million people every year try to get in, either legally or illegally. Okay? But again, you got to be careful about pride. Pride has serious problems with it, doesn't it? Right, Bill Belichick? It's your pride now. It's your safety on the first play, loser. Anyway. I just love that. And Belichick's a stickler, too. You know that drove him crazy that on the first play, his Hall of Fame quarterback threw a ball 90 million yards. I mean, that ball was halfway to Canada. I mean, my gosh. And the refs were almost not going to call it. Anyway, enough about Bill Belichick's idiocies. He's got some characteristics of somebody that I know. Total control and wants to crush all his enemies. Boy, that sounds familiar. As Hitler finished speaking, bonfires blazed out on the hilltops all along the threatened frontier. See, in Boston, somebody would have killed me over that. Although, maybe they're not. They'd be like, yeah, he lost the last 2 Super Bowls. Loser. Anyway. It was a culmination of a month in which the tramping columns of SS troops, the torchlight parades, the monster demonstrations, cheering crowds, blaring loudspeakers, and mob oratory, the streets hung with swastika flags, the open display of brutality and violence, with the police standing by in silence, all had been used to build up the impression of an irresistible force which would sweep away every obstacle in its path. And you remember the party was almost falling apart at the time. They were running out of money. In the face of all of this, it is a remarkable fact that still the German people refused to give Hitler the majority he sought. With the help of his nationalist allies, Hitler had a bare majority in the new Reichstag, but it did not escape the attention of the Nazi leaders that with the proscription of the communist deputies, they would have a clear parliamentary majority themselves without the need for the nationalist vote, meaning they were going to remove the communists. The chances of Papen, Hugenberg, and the nationalists acting as an effective brake on their partners in the coalition appeared slight. Hitler's dictatorship rested on the constitutional foundation of a single law, the so-called enabling law, the law for removing the distress of people in the Reich. And I love how, you notice how, and not that these are the same thing, but you notice, remember, those of you who are old enough to remember, what's the name of the bill that was passed right after 9/11 to give the government more expansive powers to invade people's privacy?
Patriot Act.
Yeah, and you hear a similar sort of like, what we call this as a euphemism, like a tax increase is a revenue enhancement, right? You know, or something like that, or trying to think of some other things, like when you say instead of somebody died, they passed away, that you're trying to like candy coat over what happened, or like deceive the public. And was there anything patriotic about the Patriot Act? Seemed to me to be anti-democratic on every stance. The only thing you could make the argument that it was patriotic about was it gave the tools for the government to arrest terrorists. That's about it, right? Seems to me if the government wants to be patriotic, it ought to prevent people from disliking us to the point of running buildings or running airplanes into our buildings. That's patriotism to me. Not overthrowing the government of Brazil in 1964 doesn't get you a lot of friends. Right? And I know a lot of you guys don't understand this, but if you really want to see why a lot of the world dislikes the United States military at least, why don't you, I have one word in one country for you, Haiti. Look up the details. That's all I got to say to you. Look up Somalia too if you want more proof of what the United States military does. We put dictatorships in power. Want one more? Saudi Arabia. Is that a democratic country? Hell no. That's also the country where Bin Laden's from, isn't it? Anyway. But you hear him say, using this word, that this is to help the people distress. We're trying to help people by taking away their civil liberties. I love that. As it represented an alteration of the Constitution, a majority of two-thirds of the Reichstag was necessary to pass it, and Hitler's first preoccupation after the elections was to secure this. One step was simple. The 81 communist deputies could be left out of account because they got blamed for the Reichstag fire, and he was going to outlaw them. Those who had not been arrested so far would certainly be arrested if they put in an appearance at the Reichstag. Negotiations with the center were resumed. That was the Catholic parties and some of the more moderate parties. In the meantime, Hitler showed himself in his most conciliatory mood towards his nationalist partners. Both the discussions in the cabinet and the negotiations with the center revealed the same uneasiness at the prospect of the powers the government was claiming, but the Nazis held the whip hand with the decree of 28th of April 1934, and Hitler was prepared to promise anything at this stage, I guess it was 33, sorry, to get his bill through with the appearances of legality preserved intact. The enabling bill, which was laid before the House on the 23rd of March 1933, gave the government the power for 4 years to enact laws without the cooperation of the Reichstag. This is how a democracy dies, right in front of your eyes. Right here. This is how it happened. And Germany's not the only place where this happened. Look at Russia. Do you really think the majority of people want Vladimir Putin to be their president? He's a good guy, right? He never killed anybody with his bare hands or anything, right? Being a KGB officer. He never did anything bad, right? He's an honest person. He's not corrupt, right? He's not involved in business in any way or any illegality. He's probably going to come kill me. Okay. I mean, at one point the KGB or elements of the KGB were accused of poisoning a Ukrainian presidential candidate because he disagreed with the Russian. They almost killed this guy. He looks terrible. His face is all torn to pieces. Okay, this is not the actions of a peace-loving democratic state. Okay, and you can look throughout time this has occurred. You know, it doesn't occur as much as it used to, but actually the normal direction nowadays is going from dictatorships to democracies. Okay. But I told you, there's some people around the world where monarchies and dictatorships are, in their minds, are better than democracies. And I'm telling you right now that the Russian people still have this sense about them that they like a strong-handed ruler. Some of them, at least. Okay. You find this in a lot of Eastern Europe. Not in Poland, though. They know what a steel-fisted person can do. You want to talk about people who have had it with dictators and military people. Poland's about had it. That's why they're such close friends with the United States. They've never met a country that was big and powerful like this that didn't want to beat them down. They don't know how to react to some extent, or at least at first. And the beautiful thing for Polish people is there's a lot of Polish people in the United States. And so that a lot of them immigrated to the United States during World War I or World War II, and Poland was not a country or was the battleground for the Soviets and the Nazis. And I'll tell you right now, you want to talk about some democratic loving people. And the reason why is because, again, they had their rights taken away so many times. Okay? I'd say the same thing probably about countries about Albania and stuff, although Albania's not exactly democratic. Alright, so you guys got this sort of this pattern here, and one of the main themes that should come across here is that what Hitler was trying to do was, let me ask you the question. Why was he trying to avoid illegal behavior or the impression or the label that he was deviant? Why is that important in trying to take over a government?
He wants to prove that he's an honest person, like he's legit.
Plus, what's the government and the people might might they do if you get labeled as a lunatic or a murderer?
Not elect you, not re-elect you.
Or worse,
Kick you
they'll
out
come
of
and
power.
they'll
Get a
kick you
coup.
out of the country or throw you in jail.
Have a military coup or something.
Yeah, or back then, do you think execution or assassination was beyond the German government's capacity? I'll tell you right now, the penalty for desertion in World War I was execution. And it was carried out by soldiers. I'll tell you right now, there are, as much as there are differences between World War I and World War II, there were plenty of similarities. And one of the similarities was the brutality and the atrocities. And I'll tell you right now, the Germans were as anti-Semitic and anti-Russian and a whole bunch of other stuff. It almost just extended from World War I. And that's why I still think that even without Hitler, bad things were going to happen in Germany because of this. I really do. That even if Hitler would have died at age 28, that somebody, Rome and maybe it would have been Poppin or one of these conservatives who would have done this, or maybe the military would have created a coup. I think the war would have happened regardless because of the tension that was created due to the reparations and the punishments that were placed upon Germany. I think it was patently unfair to blame Germany for the entire war. I mean, the ridiculousness of that, right? And if France and the rest of the Allies would have known, you know what's funny as well during World War I? The British were not actually obligated by treaty to get in on the side of Russia or France. They were not. They did it because they wanted to make sure to curry favor with Russia and France, because Russia and France allowed them to have India and Indonesia and all these other countries. It's so bizarre. So you see these entanglements. Not only that, back to our power elite theory. At the time, one of the reasons why the war went the way it was all of the principal monarchs in each one of the countries were related to each other somehow. They have a letter from Tsar Nicholas calling the German Kaiser Willie. And he wrote back, "Hey Nicky, I'd really not like to get into a war with you, but I'm going to kick your ass if we do." I mean, it was almost like the mayor of Boston and the mayor of New York going, "Hey, our team's going to kick your butt." Because what did the Kaiser care? He's not putting on boots and getting out on the battlefield, right? That's a beautiful thing when you're the leader. You can start wars, but you never have to fight them. Okay? Except for George Washington. Wow. I guess he didn't start it, but he was usually out there in front of his troops. So anyway, all right. So we'll stop the lecture there.